The problem with grand, galaxy-spanning civilizations is that they eventually get bored. Once you've solved faster-than-light travel, perfected matter replication, and figured out how to make a star last a little longer just by asking it nicely, you start inventing reasons to get together and measure things. And for the Cthar Imperium, the thing to measure was, is, and always will be, punching. This brings us to the 7th Decennial Intergalactic Strength Accords, held in a hall so grand it had its own gravity and a frankly pretentious dress code. The air hummed with the quiet thrum of translation fields and the much louder thrum of egos. Seated in the human delegation's floating observation pod, which was really just a fancy chair with some blinking lights, was Dr. Eris Thorne. To say Eris looked out of place was like saying a penguin would look out of place at a barbecue. I mean, yes, technically true, but it wildly undersells the sheer, comical wrongness of the image. The hall was filled with beings who used small moons as exercise balls. There were the Grolak, sentient rock slides held together by sheer stubbornness. There were the Cygnian Warstriders, 7 feet of iridescent carapace and blade-like limbs. There was even a delegate from a species that was, for all intents and purposes, a sentient, very muscular bicep. And then there was Eris. 5'6", soft around the edges in the way of a person who considers finding the remote to be a solid cardio workout, and wearing a standard-issue diplomatic jumpsuit that was about as intimidating as a pair of pajamas. She was being openly stared at. Not with malice, not really. It was more like the clinical, slightly pitiable curiosity one reserves for a museum exhibit on creatures that definitely shouldn't be here. A low, gravelly chuckle rumbled through the translation field from the Grolak pod next to her. Is that their champion, the rock creature, whose name was something unpronounceable involving tectonic grinding, rumbled to his neighbor. It has no visible exoskeleton. Its limbs are pliable. Eris heard this, of course. The universal translators were excellent. She took a slow sip from a juice box she'd brought from home. Strawberry kiwi. It was her little rebellion against the solemnity of it all. Presiding over this festival of testosterone, or the alien equivalent, which probably involved gamma rays and honor, was Proctor General Forlag of the Cthar. Forlag was built like a granite filing cabinet, with a face that looked like it had been carved out of cliffside by a sculptor who had just been given some very bad news. His voice, amplified by the hall's acoustics, was the kind of deep, resonant baritone that could curdle milk in the next star system. Delegates, he began, his 4 upper arms crossed in a gesture of extreme self-satisfaction. We gather once more to affirm the foundational principle of galactic harmony, demonstrable physical viability. For millennia, we have agreed that true strength is the bedrock of a stable society. It is the purest metric, untainted by cunning or artifice. Eris snorted softly into her juice box. Untainted by cunning. Right. That was like saying water wasn't tainted by wetness. Before us, Forlag gestured with a lower arm towards the center of the arena, stands the culmination of Cthar engineering. The Forlagian standardized gauge for kinetic compliance and species viability assessment. Catchy name. Rolls right off the tongue. In the center of the room was a 10-foot-tall pillar of gleaming, obsidian-like metal. It had no screen, no buttons, no visible interface at all, save for a single, palm-sized, perfectly smooth plate on its face, about chest-high on a Grolak. This gauge is the ultimate arbiter, Forlag boomed. Its internal structure is composed of a bonded neutronium carbide alloy, capable of withstanding the force of a directed asteroid impact. It measures not merely impact force, but the total kinetic energy transfer, the structural integrity of the striking limb, and the purity of the biological expression. It cannot be tricked. It cannot be damaged. It can only measure. He paused for dramatic effect, letting the weight of his words settle. It was a good speech, if you were into that sort of thing. Very loud. Lots of important-sounding syllables. The kind of speech that makes you feel like you should be carving something on a monument. The test is simple, Forlag continued, a sliver of what might have been a smile cracking his stony face as his gaze swept over the delegations, lingering for a moment of pure, unadulterated pity on Eris Thorne. Each species will send forth one representative. They will strike the plate. Their score will be recorded. The species demonstrating the highest level of proper kinetic expression will hold the mantle of strength for the next cycle, he said, proper kinetic expression, like it was a holy sacrament. A nervous, multi-limbed creature with enormous, perpetually worried eyes scuttled up to Forlag, holding a datapad. This was Zix, Forlag's administrative aide, a being who seemed to be composed entirely of anxiety and appendages. Proctor General, Zix chirped, his voice a series of high-pitched clicks and whistles. The delegation from Earth, their representative, Dr. Thorne, she is classified as a scientist, he said the word like it was a terminal diagnosis. Forlag's expression didn't change, but the condescension in the air thickened to the consistency of pudding. Indeed, Aide Zix. The humans are a theoretical people. They have sent us one of their thinkers. Perhaps she intends to defeat the gauge with a strongly worded argument. A wave of low rumbles and guttural clicks, the alien version of laughter, rippled through the hall. Eris just finished her juice box, flattened it neatly, and tucked it into her pocket. She looked down at the arena floor, a faint, almost imperceptible smile on her face. The other delegates saw a frail, soft-skinned creature in over its head. They saw a joke. They saw an easy win. What they didn't see, what they couldn't possibly comprehend, was that Dr. Eris Thorne was having the time of her life. She loved it when people underestimated her. It made the paperwork so much simpler afterward. Proctor General Forlag, having established the absolute invincibility of his big, black pillar of punching, now launched into the part of the ceremony everyone secretly dreaded, the educational lecture. This was a Kthar tradition, rooted in their belief that one cannot truly appreciate a good punch without first understanding the intricate physics that make the punch possible. It was, to be blunt, the most boring 15 minutes in the known universe. Let us contemplate the nature of force, Forlag began, his voice taking on the sonorous, sleep-inducing cadence of a tenured professor. Force, as defined by the ancients, equals mass times acceleration. A simple, elegant formula. But we, the Kthar, understand its deeper truths. It is not merely about moving a mass. It is about the will to move that mass. It is about the biological engine that generates the acceleration. He paced before the gauge, his heavy footfalls echoing in the cavernous hall. The other delegates shifted in their pods. The Grolak was idly grinding one of its smaller hand boulders into dust. The Signian Warstrider was meticulously polishing one of its arm blades. They'd all heard this speech before, or a version of it. It changed slightly every decade, mostly to include more adjectives describing how great the Kthar were. Consider the Grolak, Forlag said, gesturing to the rocky delegate. Their strength is one of immense mass. A body of lithified minerals, powered by geothermal energy. When a Grolak strikes, it is the planet itself striking. A pure expression of gravitational dominance. The Grolak delegate puffed out his chest, which caused a small avalanche of pebbles to cascade onto his pod's floor. Or the Signian. Forlag turned his attention to the insectoid warrior. Their power is one of velocity. A low-mass body, yes, but one capable of accelerating its limbs to supersonic speeds. Theirs is the strength of the lightning bolt. A perfect marriage of biology and kinetic release. The Warstrider stopped polishing and gave a sharp, appreciative clack of its mandibles. It was hard not to feel a little flattered. But these are merely two colors in the grand spectrum of proper kinetic expression, Forlag continued, warming to his subject. The true measure, the 1R gauge is so exquisitely designed to quantify, is the efficiency of the energy transfer. How much of the organism's biological potential is converted into raw, unadulterated force upon the target? A lesser species might waste energy on heat, on sound, on the recoil that shatters its own bones. His gaze, once again, found Eris. The implication was as subtle as a brick to the face. The human form, he said, the pity in his voice now so thick you could spread it on toast, is a study in inefficiency. A fragile endoskeleton. A low-density hydrostatic composition. Its thermal regulation is wasteful. To ask such a creature to deliver a meaningful blow is like asking a whisper to shatter a mountain. Down in her pod, Eris had pulled out a small, handheld scanner. She wasn't aiming it at Forlag, or the other delegates. She had it pointed directly at the big, scary punching machine. She wasn't listening to the speech. She'd already read the gauge's technical specifications, the publicly available ones, anyway, last week. They were fascinating. Full of impressive-sounding materials and boasting of resilience measured in teranewtons. But they had also, in their arrogance, included a detailed breakdown of the primary alloy's molecular lattice structure. The Kthar were very proud of their metallurgy. It was, Eris thought, an incredibly silly thing to brag about in a public document. Zix, the anxious aide, noticed her activity. He scuttled over to Fourlag's side, his multiple legs tripping over each other in his haste. "Proctor General," he whispered, his antennae twitching frantically. "The human, she is using a device." Fourlag paused his lecture. The entire hall turned to look at Eris. She didn't seem to notice, engrossed in the readings on her scanner. "Dr. Thorne," Fourlag's voice was dangerously calm. "Protocol 7, subsection Gamma, clearly states, all kinetic expressions must be of biological origin, unaided by technological amplification. Your scanner is not permitted." Eris looked up, blinking, as if just noticing there were other people in the room. "Oh, this," she said, holding up the small device. Her voice, unamplified, was clear and calm. "This isn't an amplifier. It's a diagnostic tool. I'm not scanning myself. I'm scanning your machine." A confused murmur went through the crowd. "Scan the gauge." "Why?" It was a solid block of nearly indestructible metal. "It didn't do anything until you hit it." "And for what purpose do you require diagnostics?" Fourlag asked, suspicion lacing every syllable. "Just curious about the material composition," Eris said with a pleasant smile. "You mentioned a bonded neutronium carbide alloy. I find metallurgy fascinating. Just wanted to check the resonant frequency. Standard professional curiosity." The hall went silent. Not a confused silence this time, but a blank one. The term, resonant frequency, meant something to the engineers present, but to the warriors and politicians, it was just a string of meaningless noises. It sounded technical, and therefore boring. Fourlag stared at her. He was a being of action, of force and mass. He understood hitting things. He did not understand frequencies. It sounded like a trick. A human trick. Cunning and artifice, the very things he'd just decried. "Your curiosity is irrelevant," he finally declared. "The gauge is a solid. It does not resonate. It endures. Put away your device. The contest will proceed." Eris shrugged and slipped the scanner back into her pocket. "Alrighty then," she said, leaning back in her chair. "Don't say I didn't ask." Fourlag, flustered by the bizarre interruption, tried to regain the momentum of his speech, but the magic was gone. He mumbled something about cellular mitochondria and wrapped it up quickly. The time for talking was over. The time for punching had begun. And as the first contestant, the Grolak, lumbered towards the obsidian pillar, Eris Thorne was humming a little tune to herself. It was a simple, repetitive melody, with a clear, rising pitch. And it was, if anyone had been listening closely enough, the exact same frequency that had just appeared on her scanner's display. The first contestant to approach the gauge was Kthar's handpicked example of raw, unadulterated power, Grand the Unyielding, the Grolak delegate. Grand was, essentially, a sentient mountain with anger management issues. Each of his steps sent a tremor through the arena floor. He didn't so much walk as he caused a series of localized geological events. He reached the pillar and took his stance. This involved bracing his granite-like feet, which were the size of dinner tables, and slowly drawing back an arm that looked like a construction crane's wrecking ball. The air crackled with geothermal energy venting from seams in his rocky hide. The other delegates leaned forward in their pods, a tangible sense of anticipation in the air. This was what they came for. Big things hitting other big things. Behold. Grand bellowed, his voice the sound of two continents having a disagreement. He swung. The impact was less of a sound and more of a physical event. A shock wave blasted outwards, making the observation pod sway and rattling the teeth of everyone inside. It was the kind of punch that didn't just hit you, it informed your ancestors that you'd been hit. For a moment, a flash of incandescent light flared at the point of contact where Grand's fist met the plate. Then, silence. The obsidian pillar stood, as promised, utterly unmarked. Not a scratch. Not a dent. On the wall behind Fourlag, a massive holographic display, previously dark, lit up. A single, glowing number appeared, 9820. A formidable display. Fourlag announced, his composure restored. He was back in his element now. A score of 9820 Kthar standard kinetic units. A testament to the Grolak people's connection to the very foundations of the universe. A truly proper kinetic expression. Grond gave a satisfied grunt and lumbered back to his pod, leaving a trail of gravel and self-satisfaction behind him. Next up was the Cygnian Warstrider, Silax. Where Grond was mass, Silax was speed. She moved with a liquid grace that was terrifying to watch, her bladed limbs a blur of motion. She didn't plant herself like the Grolak. Instead, she paced back and forth, a coiled spring of iridescent fury. She approached the gauge from the side, a whirlwind of motion. She didn't punch. She whipped her primary striking limb forward in an arc that broke the sound barrier 3 times on its way to the target. The sound was a sharp, whip-crack-crack that echoed through the hall like a thunderclap. It was precise, elegant, and utterly lethal. The holographic display flickered, and a new number appeared, 9,795. Incredible. Forlag boomed. A near-perfect score. The Cygnian mastery of velocity remains unparalleled. The energy transfer was almost 99% efficient. A beautiful, beautiful strike. Silax gave a curt, warrior's nod and returned to her pod, her honor satisfied. And so it went. One by one, the delegates of the galaxy's most physically powerful species stepped forward to test their might. A hulking, four-armed brute from Rigel 7 who tried to punch the plate with all 4 fists at once, getting a respectable but uncoordinated 8,500. A silicon-based life form that reshaped its arm into a hardened diamond spike, scoring an impressive 9,500 but also shattering its own limb in the process, a detail Forlag praised as ultimate commitment. There was even the sentient bicep, who, with the help of a small levitating platform, managed to contract so violently against the plate that it registered a 7,200, which everyone agreed was very impressive for a single muscle. Throughout it all, Eris Thorn watched. She didn't look intimidated. She didn't look worried. She looked analytical. She watched how the pillar reacted to each impact. It didn't move, of course. Not visibly. But her sensitive ears, honed by years of working in labs with delicate equipment, could pick up the faintest of sounds. After each massive blow, a high-frequency, almost inaudible hum lingered in the air for a few seconds before fading. A vibration. With each strike, the note was the same. A pure, crystalline tone. The machine was, in its own way, singing. And Eris was listening. Finally, after the last of the brawlers and bruisers had taken their turn, a heavy, expectant silence fell over the hall. Zix, the aide, nervously consulted his datapad. And now, he squeaked, his voice trembling. The final delegate. From the star system Sol, Sector 3, planet designated Earth. Dr. Eris Thorn. Every eye in the hall swiveled to the human pod. This was it. The moment of comic relief. The delegates leaned forward, some with undisguised amusement. The betting pools, which had been running on various delegates' datapads, had the odds of Eris scoring above 100 at roughly 1,000,000 to 1. The most popular bet was on which bone in her hand would break first. Eris stood up. She smoothed down her jumpsuit, took a deep breath, and stepped out of the pod onto the transport disc that would carry her to the arena floor. She still had that small, calm smile on her face. As she glided towards the center of the hall, a low murmur of snickering followed her. This should be over quickly, the Grolak rumbled to his neighbor. I hope their medical facilities are adequate, the Cygnian hissed in agreement. Forlag watched her approach, a monument of smug certainty. He had designed this test to celebrate true strength, and he was about to get a perfect demonstration of its absence. This soft, fleshy creature was about to provide the ultimate validation of his entire worldview. The contrast would be, he thought, magnificent. Eris arrived at the base of the obsidian pillar. It loomed over her, a sheer cliff of alien arrogance. She looked so small, so fragile, standing before it. She didn't look like a champion. She didn't even look like a contestant. She looked like someone who had taken a wrong turn on her way to the library and was too polite to ask for directions. And then, she started humming. Eris Thorn stood before the monolithic kinetic compliance gauge, a tiny figure dwarfed by its oppressive, silent bulk. The hall was so quiet you could hear the microscopic stress fractures forming in Zix's already strained nervous system. Everyone was waiting for the inevitable, pathetic thump followed by a yelp of pain. But Eris didn't immediately draw back her fist. She didn't adopt a fighting stance. Instead, she took a deep, centering breath, the kind you might take before a difficult presentation, not a feat of galactic strength. She reached out with her left hand, the one she wasn't going to punch with, and gently placed her fingertips against the cold, smooth surface of the strike plate. She closed her eyes. A wave of confusion washed over the assembled delegates. What was this? Some kind of meditative ritual? Was she trying to psych herself up? What is the human doing? The Grolak muttered, genuinely perplexed. Is she caressing the gauge? Forlag narrowed his eyes. A pointless delay. Perhaps a prayer to her primitive gods of bone setting. But Eris wasn't praying. She was feeling. With her fingers pressed against the plate, she began to hum. It was a low, quiet sound at first, barely audible. Then, slowly, methodically, she started to raise the pitch. She wasn't just humming a random tune. She was sliding up the scale, note by note, with the precision of a concert violinist. She was listening. Not with her ears, but with her fingertips. She was feeling for the vibration. The one she'd heard faintly after every other impact. The machine's natural, secret frequency. Her scanner had given her the ballpark figure, but she needed to be precise. The Kthar, in their hubris, had built their indestructible machine out of a single, massive, hyper-purified crystal lattice. It was strong, yes. Incredibly strong. But anything with a uniform crystalline structure, no matter how dense, has a resonant frequency. A frequency at which it vibrates more and more efficiently, absorbing energy until its own internal structure becomes its own worst enemy. It's the same principle that lets an opera singer shatter a wine glass, just scaled up to a level involving words like neutronium and interdimensional. The delegates saw a strange woman humming at a metal pillar. Eris was performing a live, tactile, resonant frequency sweep. Her humming climbed higher. A low C, a D, a sharp G, and then she felt it. A tiny, almost imperceptible tremor under her fingertips. A faint tingling that matched the note she was humming. The gauge was singing back to her. She'd found it. She stopped humming, a flicker of a smile touching her lips. She opened her eyes. She now had everything she needed. The knowledge was far more powerful than any muscle. Zix, seeing her strange ritual end, decided this was his moment to be helpful. He scuttled onto the arena floor, holding out a small, gray bar. Dr. Thorne, he chirped. A nutrient-paste supplement. Kthar battle ration. Maximum protein and carbohydrate delivery for muscular output. Eris looked at the unappetizing brick of goo and gave him a warm, genuine smile. Thank you, Zix, but I'm fine. I had a juice box earlier. Zix wilted, all 6 of his shoulders slumping in defeat, and scuttled away. Now, Eris prepared for the punch. She didn't wind up like a baseball pitcher. She didn't roar like a Grolak. She adopted a simple, balanced stance, feet shoulder-width apart. She raised her right fist, holding it not in a tight, white-knuckled ball of rage, but in a relaxed, firm shape. She took another deep breath. This wasn't about power. She couldn't hope to match the other delegates in raw energy output. She wasn't even going to try. This was about timing. Precision. It was physics, not fury. She began to tap her right foot. A steady, rhythmic beat. 1 and 2 and 3 and, building a simple rhythm. Then, she began to hum again. Not the sliding scale from before, but the single, pure note. The one the machine loved so much. And as she hummed, she began to subtly, almost invisibly, oscillate her body. A tiny, rhythmic swaying motion, perfectly in time with her tapping foot and the note she was humming. She was turning her entire body into a tuning fork, primed to deliver not just a punch, but a wave. A perfectly formed sine wave of kinetic energy, delivered at the precise frequency that would turn the gauge's greatest strength, its rigid, uniform structure, into its most catastrophic weakness. The delegates were utterly baffled. This was the strangest pre-punch ritual they had ever seen. It was less like a warrior preparing for battle and more like a musician tuning her instrument. Forlag scoffed. Enough of this performance, he boomed. Strike the gauge, human, and receive your judgment. Eris ignored him. Her eyes were focused on the plate. She had one shot at this. She had to introduce the frequency into the system in a way it couldn't dampen. A short, sharp, perfectly timed pulse. She finished her fourth oscillation. Her body was now a loaded spring, vibrating in perfect sympathy with the machine's soul. She exhaled. And she punched. The punch itself was a masterpiece of anticlimax. It wasn't a thunderous crash or a supersonic crack. It was just a sharp, clean thwack. A sound no louder than a hardcover book being dropped on a wooden table. It was, by all accounts, a completely unremarkable punch. Her fist made contact with the smooth, black plate for barely a fraction of a second. There was no flash of light, no shockwave. By the standards of everything they had seen before, it was laughably weak. For a full second, nothing happened. A Grolac delegate actually started to laugh, a low, grinding sound. Forlag allowed himself a smug, triumphant smirk. The human had failed. Gloriously. Pathetically. And then, a low hum began to emanate from the obsidian pillar. It started quietly, the same high-frequency note Eris had been humming. But it grew in volume, rising rapidly. The smooth, black surface of the gauge began to shimmer, a visible distortion in the air around it. The delegates' laughter died in their throats. Forlag's smirk froze, then melted into a puddle of confusion. The hum became a piercing whine. The entire 10-foot pillar was now visibly vibrating, shaking with a furious, internal energy that had come from nowhere. Hairline cracks, glowing with a faint inner light, began to spiderweb across its supposedly indestructible surface. What is this? Forlag gasped, taking an involuntary step back. What is happening? The whine rose to an unbearable shriek. The glowing cracks spread, joining together, forming a complex, crystalline pattern of failure. The single, solid note of the resonating pillar began to fracture into 1,000 discordant tones. And then, with a sound like a billion wine glasses shattering at once, the Forlagian standardized gauge for kinetic compliance and species viability assessment fell apart. It didn't explode. It didn't shatter into a million pieces. It simply disintegrated. The bonded neutronium carbide alloy lost all structural integrity at the molecular level. The 10-foot pillar crumbled into a heap of glittering, black dust and razor-sharp crystalline shards, collapsing in on itself with a final, mournful shhhhhhh. Where the ultimate arbiter of strength had stood just moments before, there was now only a pile of sparkling black sand and a faint, lingering smell of ozone. The holographic display on the wall, which had been waiting to show a pathetic, single-digit score, flickered erratically. It flashed a series of bizarre symbols, a string of error codes, and then, for one glorious, final moment, it displayed the highest number its programming could possibly generate, 99,999. Then, with a pop and a puff of smoke from its projector, it went permanently dark. The hall was plunged into a silence so profound, so absolute, that it felt louder than any noise. Every single being in the room, from the mightiest Grolac to the lowliest maintenance drone, was staring at the pile of dust on the arena floor, and then at the small, soft-looking woman standing calmly beside it. Eris Thorne lowered her fist. She gave her knuckles a little shake, as if to get the feeling back into them. "Huh," she said to the silent, gaping hall. "Guess it wasn't indestructible after all." The silence that followed the gauge's spectacular deconstruction was a living entity. It filled the hall, pressing in on everyone, thick with disbelief and a heavy dose of, what in the seven hells just happened? The delegates stared, their various mouths, mandibles, and facial orifices hanging open. The Grolac, Grand, was trying to process how a creature with the physical density of a fruit snack had just accomplished what his planet-shaking punch could not. The Cygnian Warstrider, Silax, was re-evaluating her entire life's philosophy on the application of velocity. And then there was Zix. Poor, overwhelmed Zix. His large, expressive eyes rolled back into his head, his dozens of spindly legs gave a collective shudder, and he fainted dead away, collapsing into a neat, symmetrical pile of unconscious aid. He had simply run out of the ability to be surprised, and his brain had opted for a full system shutdown. It was Proctor General Forlag who broke the silence. His reaction was a fascinating, multi-stage journey through the 5 stages of grief, performed in about 7 seconds. First came denial, as he stared at the pile of dust that used to be his pride and joy. Then came anger, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Bargaining was skipped, as there was no one to bargain with. Depression was a brief flicker of despair in his stony eyes. And finally, came acceptance. The acceptance that something had gone horribly, horribly wrong, and that it was absolutely, positively, someone else's fault. Cheat. The word exploded from him, echoing through the stunned hall. She cheated. This is an outrage. A mockery of the Accords. He stormed forward, his heavy boots crunching on the glittering dust of his ruined machine. He jabbed a thick, accusatory finger at Eris. A finger the size of a traffic cone. The gauge is invincible, he roared, his voice cracking with fury and disbelief. It is designed to withstand the kinetic output of a supernova. For it to fail in such a manner, you must have used a weapon. A sonic device. A vibrational imploder. Something concealed on your person. He was grasping at straws, his rigid, force-obsessed mind utterly incapable of processing what it had just witnessed. In his world, things broke because they were hit with a bigger, harder thing. The gauge was the biggest, hardest thing. Therefore, it could not break. The fact that it had broken was a violation of the fundamental laws of his universe. Eris looked at the ranting, four-armed slab of granite and then down at her own hands. She turned them over, showing they were empty. No weapons, she said calmly. My jumpsuit doesn't even have pockets, really. Barely room for a flattened juice box. Lies. Deception. Four-Lag bellowed. He turned to the other delegates, seeking support. I demand an inquiry. I invoke Protocol 1, subsection Alpha. Challenges to the integrity of the test must be resolved before a victor is declared. The human's result is null and void until she can explain this technological vandalism. He was now clutching a datapad that Six had conveniently dropped when he fainted. He scrolled through it furiously, looking for the right regulation to invalidate reality. Protocol 7, subsection Gamma, he shouted, finding his ace in the hole. All kinetic expressions must be of biological origin, unaided by technological amplification. Your humming. Your strange ritual. It was a vocal command for a hidden device. The other delegates began to murmur amongst themselves. A weapon. It seemed plausible. More plausible, certainly, than the alternative, that the soft creature had somehow punched the machine to death. It was a comfortable explanation, one that allowed them to put the universe back into its neat, orderly box where big, strong things were big and strong, and small, soft things were not. Eris just stood there, letting him finish his tirade. She waited until he had run out of regulations to shout, his chest heaving with righteous indignation. Are you done? She asked, her tone polite and genuinely curious. Four-Lag sputtered, momentarily thrown off by her lack of fear. I am not done. I am upholding the sanctity of this ancient and honorable tradition. Okay, great, Eris said with a nod. Sanctity, got it. Now, would you and the other delegates like to know what actually happened? Or would you prefer to keep yelling theories about secret imploders? She posed the question to the entire hall. The murmuring stopped. The delegates looked at each other, and then back at Eris. Curiosity, it turned out, was a more powerful force than outrage. They wanted to know. They needed to know. Even Four-Lag, for all his bluster, fell silent. He wanted to hear her lie, so he could tear it apart. Eris took a deep breath. It was time for the other kind of science. The part where you have to explain complex concepts to people who think physics is just a suggestion. There was no weapon, she began, her voice carrying easily in the silent hall. There was no technological amplification. The Proctor General was correct. My kinetic expression was 100% biological in origin. The problem wasn't with my punch. The problem was with your machine. Eris walked over to the pile of shimmering dust, crouching down to pick up a single, sharp-edged shard. She held it up for all to see. Proctor General, she said, her voice taking on the patient tone of a teacher explaining a concept for the third time. You are very proud of your neutronium carbide alloy. And you should be. It's incredibly strong. Its compressive strength is, as you said, comparable to a celestial body. You focused entirely on making it withstand a single, massive, brute force impact. She paused, letting that sink in. But in your quest for purity and strength, you made your gauge out of a single, perfectly uniform, monolithic crystalline lattice. Am I correct? One of the Kthar engineers in Forlag's entourage, a being who looked like a slightly smaller, more worried filing cabinet, gave a hesitant nod. I thought so, Eris continued. You see, anything with a repeating, uniform structure has a weakness. It has a natural harmonic. A frequency at which it prefers to vibrate. It's called resonance. She started to pace, using her hands to illustrate her point. Imagine you're pushing a kid on a swing. If you push at random times, you don't get them very high. But if you time your pushes perfectly, matching the rhythm of the swing's own movement, each little push adds more and more energy. The swing goes higher and higher, all with minimal effort. That's resonance. You're adding energy to a system in a way that the system itself amplifies. The delegates were listening intently now. The analogy was simple enough for even the most muscle-bound warrior to grasp. Your machine, Eris said, pointing to the pile of dust, was a swing. A very, very, very strong swing, but a swing nonetheless. Every time a delegate hit it, the impact energy caused it to vibrate for a few seconds. It was a very high-frequency vibration, almost undetectable. The machine's internal dampeners were designed to handle the big, messy energy of a punch, but they ignored this tiny, pure vibration. To them, it was just noise. She looked directly at Forlag. But it wasn't noise. It was a note. It was the machine's resonant frequency. My scanner confirmed the approximate range, but I needed to be exact. That's why I was humming. I was providing a range of frequencies and using my fingertips to feel when the machine started to vibrate in sympathy. I was finding its note. A ripple of understanding went through the more technically minded members of the audience. The Kthar engineer's jaw dropped. My punch, Eris concluded, holding up her fist, was not powerful in the way you measure power. I didn't dump a massive amount of energy into it all at once. Instead, I delivered a short, sharp, perfectly timed pulse of kinetic energy. It wasn't a blow, it was a catalyst. It was the first, perfectly timed push on the swing. The energy from my fist was just enough to get the resonance started, and the machine's own perfect, crystalline structure did the rest. It amplified the tiny vibration, shaking itself apart from the inside out at a molecular level. It wasn't my strength that broke your machine, Proctor General. It was your machine's own strength, turned against itself. She held up the shard of crystal again. You built a bell, and you prided yourself on how hard it was to crack with a hammer. I just figured out how to ring it. The explanation hung in the air, simple, elegant, and absolutely devastating. It recontextualized the entire event. This wasn't a failure of the human, but a catastrophic design flaw in the Kthar's most prized piece of technology. A flaw born not of incompetence, but of arrogance. They had prepared for every conceivable type of brute force, but had never once considered an attack based on finesse. They had built a lock that could withstand a battering ram, but had forgotten to check if someone could just pick it. The Kthar engineer who had nodded earlier now looked like he was going to be physically sick. He was probably the one who designed it. He was seeing his career crumble into glittering dust right alongside the gauge. Proctor General Forlag stood frozen, his mind a battlefield of conflicting ideas. On one side was his entire life's philosophy: strength is might, bigger is better, hitting things solves problems. On the other was this tiny, soft-spoken creature and her infuriatingly logical explanation about singing. His brain, which was very good at calculating impact trajectories and armor penetration values, simply could not compute. But, he stammered, his authority evaporating with every word. Protocol 7, it was still artifice. Cunning. It was not a pure, direct application of force. Wasn't it? Eris countered gently. My muscles contracted. My arm accelerated. My fist impacted the plate. Every part of it was biological. The rules say nothing about the intelligence with which the biological force is applied. You tested for strength. You never thought to test for cleverness. She let that final word hang in the air. Cleverness. The one variable they had dismissed as irrelevant. The one thing that had turned their entire competition on its head. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't confusion anymore. It was respect. A slow, dawning wave of it that spread from pod to pod. The Cygnian war strider, Silax, gave a slow, deliberate clack of her mandibles. It was a sign of martial esteem, a warrior's acknowledgement of a battle won not through might, but through superior strategy. The Grolak, Grand, let out a low rumble, but this time it sounded less like a chuckle and more like the shifting of tectonic plates, a deep, foundational change in his rocky worldview. He was beginning to understand that there were mountains that could be brought down by a whisper. The delegates who had bet against Eris were groaning and frantically trying to cancel their wagers. A small, furry delegate from a nearby system, who had apparently placed a large bet on Eris at 1,000 to 1 odds just for the sheer absurdity of it, was now doing a silent, ecstatic dance in his pod. The paradigm in the room had irrevocably shifted. The Kthar's entire platform, their claim to galactic leadership based on the principle of proper kinetic expression, had been dismantled. Not by a rival empire or a powerful fleet, but by one human scientist who paid attention in physics class. Forlag looked around, seeing the faces of his peers. He saw their respect was no longer directed at him. It was aimed at the human. He had been humbled. Utterly and completely, in front of the entire galactic community. His grand ceremony of strength had culminated in a lecture on harmonics from the weakest person in the room. The irony was so thick it was probably generating its own gravity. He looked down at the datapad in his hand, the one with all his precious rules. He scrolled back to the results section. The official record. The last entry was Grand's 9,820. There was no entry for Eris. Her score had broken the scoreboard before it could be logged. Technically, he said, his voice a low, defeated rasp, there is no official score for the human delegate. The gauge malfunctioned. Before a reading could be taken, it was a weak, bureaucratic out, but it was the only one he had left. Eris smiled. That's fine, she said. But your own rules state that the destruction of the target constitutes a successful test. I believe the term used in Kthar martial traditions is total victory, isn't it? She had, of course, also read up on their cultural history. It paid to be prepared. Forlag flinched as if she'd struck him. She had used his own culture's jargon against him. The final checkmate. He stood there for a long moment, the weight of a dozen civilizations' eyes upon him. Then, he did the only thing he could. He bowed. It was a stiff, grudging movement, like a glacier calving into the sea, but it was a bow nonetheless. A formal admission of defeat. The victory belongs to Earth, he ground out, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. A smattering of polite, if still slightly bewildered, applause broke out. On the floor, Zix began to stir, his antennae twitching. He sat up, looked at the pile of dust, at the bowing Proctor General, and at the serenely smiling human. Oh, my, he chirped faintly. Did I miss the human's turn? The aftermath of the great punching debacle was, predictably, a bureaucratic nightmare wrapped in an existential crisis. Committees were formed. Inquiries were launched. The Kthar Engineering Corps was sent into a collective spiral of shame and frantic redesigns. Memos were written with titles like Unforeseen Acoustic Vulnerabilities in Neutronium-Based Alloys, and Mandatory Cross-Disciplinary Training in Waveform Physics for All Future Munitions Projects. Forlag, stripped of his ceremonial title as Master of the Gauge, was reassigned to a remote outpost to oversee the cataloging of atmospheric dust mites, a job considered deeply, deeply humiliating. The last Eris saw of him, he was being forced to sign a mountain of forms with a pen that had run out of ink, a final, petty indignity that felt poetically just. Eris, meanwhile, became the most popular person at the Accords. She was mobbed by delegates wanting to understand her methods. Warriors who had spent centuries honing their bodies wanted to know about resonance striking. Engineers begged her for consultations. The furry little delegate who won the betting pool tried to give her a cut of his winnings, a truly staggering sum. She politely turned it all down. She had no interest in becoming a galactic martial arts guru. She hadn't come to the Accords to win, or to prove humanity's worth, or to make a grand statement. She'd come because her department head had drawn the short straw, and she was the only one with a current intergalactic travel visa. Her only real goal had been to get through the ceremony without causing an incident. She reflected, failed spectacularly at that. In the final session of the Accords, the Cygnian delegate, Silax, acting as interim proctor, officially awarded the mantle of strength to humanity. It was a large, ornate staff that pulsed with a soft inner light. Eris accepted it with a polite nod. On behalf of Earth, she said, addressing the assembled delegates, thank you. We're honored. However, we respectfully propose a motion to amend the accords for the next cycle. A curious murmur went through the hall. We propose, Eris continued, that the test of strength be redefined. Perhaps next time, instead of seeing who can punch the hardest, we can see who can build the most efficient water purifier. Or who can compose the most moving piece of music. Or maybe just, who can tell the best joke. She looked around the hall at the assembled warriors and titans. You're all incredibly strong. Nobody is debating that. But maybe, just maybe, the bedrock of a stable society isn't how hard you can hit something, but how many different ways you can find to not have to hit it at all. Her proposal was met with a thoughtful silence, which was, in Eris's opinion, far better than applause. Later, as she was packing up her pod to go home, Zix scuttled up to her, carrying a tray. He was no longer Forlag's aide, having been hastily promoted to an interdelegation liaison, a job that suited his frantic, people-pleasing nature far better. Dr. Thorne, he chirped, his antennae wiggling with admiration. I brought you something. On the tray was a steaming mug. It smelled familiar. Is that coffee? Eris asked, her eyes widening. Real, actual, roasted bean coffee. A near impossibility this far from Earth. My species are traders, Zix explained proudly. We can find anything. I analyzed your metabolic data from the diplomatic files. It indicated a high dependency on this particular alkaloid solution for optimal cognitive function. I hope the roast is acceptable. Eris took the mug and inhaled the aroma. It was perfect. Zix, she said with genuine emotion. You are the greatest being I have ever met. He blushed a deep shade of lavender. I also took the liberty of certifying your result, he added, handing her a datapad. She looked at the official document. It was a formal certificate from the Intergalactic Strength Accords. In the space for the score, where a number should have been, Zix had simply typed, unequivocal, in the section 4, method of kinetic expression, he had written, applied physics. Eris smiled. She took a long, blissful sip of her coffee. The mantle of strength was propped up in the corner of her pod, already gathering a bit of dust. She'd probably donate it to a museum when she got home. It would make a nice story. The story of the time humanity was invited to a galactic punching contest, and instead of sending a soldier, they sent a scientist. The story of how they learned that the most powerful muscle in the human body wasn't in the arm or the leg, but the 3-pound lump of gray matter sitting behind the eyes. And the story of how a quiet, unassuming woman with a juice box and a working knowledge of resonance taught an entire galaxy that if you build your walls strong enough, you can't hear the music that will bring them down.